He inherited nothing more than an old sawmill by a lonely creek, rotting beams, flooded tunnels, and a reputation so bad the whole town called it a worthless death trap. Andrew Collins, a worn-down 59-year-old realtor just trying to survive his debts, thought he was walking into another failure, but his loyal German Shepherd, Scout, sensed something buried beneath the mud and rust. What they uncovered was a hidden web of tunnels, lost engineering logs, and evidence of a decades-old scandal that powerful men had tried to erase. A discovery that would bring justice to forgotten veterans, restore a broken community, and turn a discarded relic into something priceless. Before the story unfolds, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and tell us, where in the world are you watching from? The morning mist drifted low over Mill Creek, pale and thin like a veil caught on the pines. Andrew Collins stepped out of his aging blue pickup, the door groaning in protest, as though even the truck understood the reluctance in his movements. At 60, Andrew carried a quiet heaviness in his tall, lean frame, an exhaustion that did not come from age alone, but from years of setbacks piling on top of each other, like fallen boards in a forgotten shed. His gray-blue eyes, once sharp with the confidence of a seasoned realtor, had dulled into the gaze of a man who had learned too well how quickly good fortune could rot. The salt and pepper hair peeking beneath his worn cap matched the trimmed stubble along his jaw, both adding to the rugged, slightly weather-beaten look of a man who often worked outdoors but didn't complain about it. He stared at the property in front of him, the abandoned sawmill he had unexpectedly inherited, the sagging roof, the moss-covered siding, the broken windows staring back like hollow eyes. The townsfolk had called it worthless, dangerous, even cursed, but to Andrew it mostly felt like an insult wrapped in legal paperwork. His great-uncle, once an engineer with ambitious ideas, had left Andrew nothing else, not a dollar, not a sentimental letter, just this. Behind him, the heavy thump of paws met the ground. Scout, his 6-year-old German Shepherd, jumped out of the truck and landed with practiced agility. The dog was strong and broad-shouldered, black and tan fur gleaming with dew, and a small tear on his right ear that gave him a slightly roguish look. His amber eyes scanned the surroundings with a sharpness far brighter than Andrew's own. Scout had always sensed things before Andrew did. Storms, strangers, danger, and even the moments when loneliness curled too close to his owner's ribs. The dog moved forward, alert, tail low but steady, sniffing the air as though it carried a message only he could read. Andrew shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and took a slow breath. He wasn't here out of hope, he knew that much. Hope had drained out of him during the years after his divorce, when the bills grew louder and the clients fewer. He had once taken pride in helping families find their place, but now he couldn't even keep his own financial life from splintering. The inheritance letter hadn't been a lifeline. It had felt more like life's final joke. Still, he had driven here, maybe because something inside him, some stubborn, battered remnant of duty, wanted to see the damage for himself. Maybe because he needed, desperately, to feel that something in his life was still within his control. He walked toward the mill's main office, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. The smell of wet timber, rusted metal, and decades-old dust seeped from every crack. Scout followed closely, occasionally nudging Andrew's leg in that protective way of his. The office door creaked sharply as Andrew pushed it open. Inside, the space was dim, the windows clouded with grime. Rotten floorboards groaned beneath his weight. The room was littered with yellowed papers, cracked tools, and a toppled-over filing cabinet whose drawers had spilled their guts long ago. Despite the filth, Andrew felt a strange tug in his chest, an old, familiar instinct whispering that someone had once loved this place enough to try to keep records of every bolt and valve. On the desk, half buried under a collapsed shelf, he found a leather-bound technical journal. His great-uncle's name was written on the first page in careful block letters. Inside, sketches of water pressure systems. Notes about sluice gates, measurements marked heart chamber of the dam, and symbols, so many symbols. Andrew traced one with his finger, an uneasy warmth spreading in his palm. Why would an engineer hide so much detail? Why bury it instead of publishing it? Why leave it all behind for him, a man who had never built anything more complex than a garden shed? Before he could answer himself, Scout stiffened. The dog's ears pricked forward. A low, rumbling growl vibrated in Scout's throat. Not the aggressive kind. This was different. A warning, a question, a call. Scout walked slowly toward an old cabinet in the corner, its doors half-rotted, hinges rusted. He lowered his head, sniffed once, then began pawing underneath with urgent insistence. Andrew approached cautiously. "Scout, what is it, boy?" With a sharp tug, the dog dragged something out from the darkness. A brass surveying compass, heavy and cold, still intact despite the decades, and a folded piece of paper covered in letters, numbers, and tiny coordinate marks arranged like a coded map. Andrew felt his heartbeat shift, slightly but undeniably, like the first flicker of a flame trying to rise after years of ash. He unfolded the paper slowly. The symbols felt intentional, aligned, calling. But the moment he leaned closer, something else happened. The wooden wall behind him creaked, not the soft settling of an old building, a deliberate, measured creak, as if someone had just stepped somewhere they shouldn't. Andrew turned, breath caught halfway. The office was empty. Scout growled again, deeper this time, and from somewhere behind the sawmill, something answered. The unsettling creak Andrew heard the previous morning still echoed faintly in his head as he drove toward the historical library on the north side of town. Scout sat in the passenger seat, posture rigid, amber eyes fixed out of the window as though tracking something only he could sense. Andrew had slept poorly. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the coded symbols on the folded paper and felt again that eerie shift in the mill's wooden walls. He wasn't a superstitious man, but years of tough breaks and hollow promises had taught him to pay attention when something felt wrong. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the library, releasing a breath of old paper and polished floors. Behind the central desk sat Dr. Nora Hayes, the woman townsfolk jokingly called the historian who can read dust. Nora was 62, tall and wiry, with silver-streaked dark hair pinned into an efficient twist. Her hazel eyes were bright and mischievous beneath square-framed glasses, the kind that gave her an air of sharp intelligence. She wore a charcoal gray cardigan over a crisp blouse, sensible shoes, and an expression suggesting she could dismantle any lie in under 5 seconds. Nora had once been a professor in Seattle, but after an academic feud soured her trust in institutions, she returned to her hometown to preserve its memory instead of arguing about it. She looked up from a stack of maps and raised an eyebrow. "Andrew Collins, haven't seen you in ages. What trouble have you inherited this time?" Andrew handed her the folded page and the yellowed technical journal. "You tell me." Nora unfolded the paper and studied it with the intensity of a jeweler inspecting a flawed gem. She murmured, tapping one of the symbols. "These markings, they're from the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. Depression-era work crews built half the infrastructure in these hills. Tunnels, pump bunkers, pressure chambers for the dam. Your great-uncle must have been involved." Andrew leaned forward. "And the coordinates?" Nora's lips curved into a half-smile. "Rumor says a group of local officials siphoned funds meant for injured veterans. When the investigation heated up, the culprits hid their accounting books and payroll ledgers in an underground chamber, somewhere beneath the sawmill or near it. Most people think it's just folklore, but..." She tapped the coded page. "This looks like directions." A mix of skepticism and unease stirred in Andrew's chest. "My luck isn't good enough for treasure. More likely it's mold." Nora looked at him over her glasses. Sometimes truth is more dangerous than treasure. Before Andrew could respond, the library door swung open. A broad-shouldered man entered, shaking off the cold like it was beneath him. Martin Kane, 56, expensive suit, immaculate, dark gray hair slicked back with precise symmetry. His jawline was sharp, clean-shaven, and his skin sun-warmed from golf outings. Not labor. His steel-gray eyes were the kind that assessed people like assets, calculating value rather than humanity. He had built his real estate empire through forceful deals and what locals politely called creative persistence. Rumor said he once bought out an entire neighborhood by pressuring families individually until they cracked. He spotted Andrew and smiled, but the warmth in it was thinner than frost. "Collins, heard you came into a little inheritance." Martin placed a hand on Andrew's shoulder. Too friendly, too firm. "If you ever want help clearing that mess, I'm your man. I pay well for land that won't do you any good." Honora's eyebrows shot up. "That's subtle," she muttered. Andrew stepped back. "I'm just looking into family history, that's all." Martin's smile faltered, briefly revealing the cold calculation beneath. Then he nodded politely, turned, and strode toward the archive shelves as if he owned the place. Scout, who had remained close to Andrew's leg, let out a low rumble, not loud enough to draw attention, but enough for Andrew to feel the vibration. The dog's fur bristled. "Easy, boy," Andrew whispered, though his own shoulders had stiffened. Later that afternoon, back at the sawmill, the air hung damp and still. Andrew and Scout walked the perimeter, the paper with coordinates tucked safely in Andrew's jacket. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe confirmation that the coded map was nonsense, maybe clues supporting Nora's claims, or maybe just a reason to shake off Martin Kane's unsettling interest. Scout sniffed along the exterior wall and suddenly stopped. His body tensed, ears perked, and he pressed a paw firmly against one section of timber. Andrew frowned and knocked on it, hollow. "Old ventilation shaft," Andrew guessed. Scout pawed harder, claws scraping against the softened wood. A few strikes later, a panel cracked, revealing a dark, narrow cavity behind it. Inside was a rusted cylindrical pipe running vertically, an antique ventilation conduit built decades earlier, big enough for air but too small for a person. Dust drifted out like breath released after long imprisonment. "Well, I'll be," Andrew murmured. "Scout, are you trying to get promoted to site foreman?" Scout's response was immediate and delightfully inconvenient. He snatched the half sandwich in Andrew's pocket, darted a few steps away, and sat triumphantly with it between his paws, tail thumping. Andrew barked out a laugh so sudden it startled even himself. The sound felt rusty, unused for years. "That's theft," he said, "but I'll let it slide." The momentary humor eased the tension clinging to his ribs, but as he knelt to inspect the ventilation pipe, he noticed something odd. Small traces of mud inside the cavity, smeared higher than Scout could have reached. Mud that looked fresh. His breath thinned. Someone had been here, recently, and not just near the mill, inside its walls. Scout lifted his head, sandwich forgotten, ears pointing toward the tree line as though hearing something Andrew couldn't. Then, from somewhere deeper under the mill floor, a hollow thud echoed. Dull, distant, impossible. Andrew froze. Scout growled, low and sharp, and the hollow space behind the timber wall seemed to breathe. Rain came down in slanted sheets that night, stitching the darkness into one trembling curtain. Andrew Collins stood inside the sawmill's main office, with Scout pressed against his leg, the dog's fur damp and his posture tense. The hollow thud they had heard earlier still gnawed at Andrew's nerves, but exhaustion and worry had tangled into such a knot that he could hardly tell paranoia from instinct anymore. Scout, however, had no such confusion. His amber eyes stayed fixed on the windows, tracking shadows like silent threats. A sudden flicker of headlights washed across the room. Scout growled low. Moments later, the office door opened, letting in a gust of cold air and the smell of wet asphalt. Martin Kane stepped inside, but tonight, unlike earlier at the library, he wore a long cream-colored raincoat. Immaculate despite the storm, its smooth surface gleaming faintly under the dusty lights. It hugged his tall, broad frame with tailored precision. His slicked-back dark gray hair showed not a strand out of place. Even the rain seemed reluctant to cling to him. There was something deeply unsettling about a man remaining so clean while the world around him drowned. "Collins," Martin greeted, his voice smooth but hollow. "Working late? Admirable." Andrew stiffened, instinctively stepping between Martin and Scout. He noticed Martin's eyes sweep the room, not casually, but calculatingly, as if measuring which parts of the building still held value. Martin produced a white envelope and placed it on the desk. Inside was a check. The number written so large it made Andrew's throat tighten. Enough to erase every debt, every sleepless night, every letter marked "Final Notice." "Consider it a friendly offer," Martin said. "You hand over the property deed tonight, and your troubles disappear. This mill isn't safe. For a man like you," his eyes narrowed slightly, "and a dog like that, accidents happen in places like this." Scout's growl sharpened. Andrew felt a cold spike of anger cut through his fatigue. He had spent his life learning to read people, clients, sellers, liars with polished handshakes. And Martin Kane, with his spotless coat and predatory calm, fit the last category too well. Andrew pushed the envelope back. No deal. The smile that touched Martin's lips didn't reach his eyes. Stubbornness is expensive. He turned without another word and disappeared into the storm, his coat still impossibly clean as the door slammed behind him. Scout barked once. sharp, accusing, as if saying, "Something is wrong." Later that night, Andrew returned to the pump bunker alone, with Scout at his heel. The rain had slowed to a whisper, dripping from the eaves like ticking clocks. Andrew carried a flashlight and the coded map Nora had partially deciphered. He tried to focus on the puzzle instead of Martin's unsettling visit, but the moment he descended the metal ladder, a chemical stench hit him. At first, it was faint, sharp, metallic, then powerful enough to burn the back of his throat. "Gas," he muttered, alarmed. He swung the flashlight toward the valve system. One of the main regulators had been turned, deliberately, far past its safe position, and a thin plume of vapor curled slowly upward, mixing with the damp air. Andrew's head swam. His vision blurred at the edges. He stumbled forward, legs suddenly heavy. Scout barked frantically, grabbing Andrew's sleeve in his teeth. The dog braced his body, pulling with surprising strength. Andrew tried to resist, tried to stay upright, but the gas made everything liquid and distant. Scout yanked harder, dragging him toward the emergency vent grate, pushing his head near the incoming airstream. The clean rush of oxygen hit Andrew's lungs like cold needles. He gasped, coughing hard enough to see stars. Scout stood over him, ears flattened, tail stiff, eyes wild with worry. Andrew rested a hand on the dog's shoulder, breath still unsteady. "You saved my life again." But beneath the gratitude, a darker truth curled in his stomach. Someone had tampered with the system. Someone wanted him out of the way, and Martin Kane had shown up tonight with the very confidence of a man who had already predicted the outcome. As soon as Andrew regained his strength, he called Nora Hayes. Within half an hour, she arrived in her old green sedan, soaked to the knees but sharp as ever. Scout greeted her with a bark that sounded more like a status report. Inside the Mills office, under the flickering overhead light, Nora spread the coded page, Andrew's great-uncle's journal, and a county map across the desk. Rain tapped the windows like fingers urging them to hurry. "Look," Nora said, circling several matching symbols. "These markings align with old sea infrastructure. Pressure chambers, emergency sluice controls, drainage tunnels. Your great-uncle wasn't doodling. He was charting the internal arteries of the Mill Creek Dam system." Andrew frowned. "You're saying this place is connected directly to the dam?" "Yes," Nora replied. "And this phrase, the heart chamber, that's no metaphor. It's the central pressure vault. If the ledgers are hidden anywhere, it's there, but it's protected by a maze of water traps. One wrong valve turn and..." She sliced the air with her hand. "Flooded." Andrew rubbed his face. "So, let me get this straight. A realtor, a historian, and one very stubborn dog are supposed to outmaneuver a man like Martin Kane and navigate a booby-trapped hydro maze?" Nora's smirk flickered. "Two people, and a historian who knows the sheriff's personal number." Scout wagged his tail once, as if volunteering. They arranged the pipes and tunnels on the map, sketching a rough layout of the labyrinth below the mill. It looked less like infrastructure and more like the circulatory system of some buried beast. And as Andrew leaned closer, Scout suddenly nudged his arm, eyes fixed on the floorboards above the pump bunker. Someone, moved beneath them, again. But this time the sound wasn't distant. It was directly under Andrew's feet. Moist earth pressed in around them as Andrew Collins lowered himself into the narrow ventilation shaft, the old iron ladder groaning under his weight. Scout followed nimbly, his muscular 6-year-old German Shepherd frame moving with a silent confidence born from instincts sharper than any tool Andrew carried. Nora Hayes descended last, her wiry frame surprisingly agile for a woman in her late 70s, silver wisps of hair escaping her hood, as she muttered about how history never lies, but it certainly knows how to hide. Their flashlights carved thin tunnels of light through the damp darkness. The walls bore faint chalk markings, numbers, arrows, and faded initials left by long-gone CCC workers. Andrew brushed his fingers over them, feeling history breathe under his touch. "They were guiding each other," he murmured, "like a trail for the next shift. Or a warning for whoever came after," Nora added, her voice echoing down the tunnel. Scout suddenly halted, shoulders stiffening, tail lifting. He sniffed the mud near a shallow dip in the floor, then scraped at it with his paw. Andrew knelt, sweeping away the dirt. Beneath it lay a rectangular metal plate stamped with shallow grooves, a pressure panel. "These were built to regulate flow during emergencies," Nora whispered. "He's found another one." Andrew felt a flicker of pride watching Scout. Years of grief had drained his world of meaning, yet this dog kept offering him a path forward step by step, as if deliberately stitching courage back into him. They pressed deeper into the labyrinth. The tunnel widened until they entered a cavernous chamber of rusted pipes and valves glistening with condensation, the central valve control room. The air was heavy with the scent of old metal and river silt. Each valve wheel was huge, its spokes thick as Andrew's arm. At the far wall stood a steel mechanism, painted with faint red marks matching the cipher on Andrew's coded note. Nora stepped forward, her sharp hazel eyes scanning the symbols. "These numbers match the sequence on your great-uncle's map. We must open and close these in the exact order or—" She hesitated. "The auxiliary floodgates will activate." Andrew grimaced. "Then we don't get a second chance." With steady breaths, the two began working the sequence. Andrew strained against the heavy valve spokes, muscles in his arms burning. Nora called out the next number each time, her voice steady, her hands gripping the flashlight like a conductor guiding an orchestra through a dangerous symphony. On the seventh valve, a deep groan rumbled through the chamber. Pipes shook. Water levels far below shifted with a distant roar. A seam of metal slid open in the floor, revealing a narrow stairway leading into a steel-lined vault. They descended. Inside lay a long iron chest and several sealed crates covered in dust, thick as velvet. Andrew pried the chest open. Inside were ledger books, payment, receipts, and handwritten testimonies from engineers and workers. Documents detailing the embezzlement of medical funds owed to veterans. The evidence traced a chain of corruption through decades, ultimately pointing to a corporate identity that evolved into Martin Kane's empire. Nora exhaled slowly. Your great-uncle wasn't chasing ghosts. He was documenting a crime so big it could drown a town. Before Andrew could answer, a violent blast shook the chamber. Dust rained from the ceiling. A section of the side wall cracked open, blown inward by explosives. Martin Kane stepped through the ragged breach, his immaculate coat replaced by a tactical jacket, dark and slick with rain. The clean, charming developer mask was gone. In its place stood a man carved from ambition and cruelty. Behind him were two men, rough, broad-shouldered, faces hidden under black hoods, carrying small detonators. "Knew you'd find it for me," Kane said smoothly. "You always struck me as the diligent type." Scout growled, teeth bared. Andrew stepped protectively in front of the dog. "This ends today, Kane." "Oh, it will," Kane replied, lifting a remote explosive trigger. "One way or—" He never finished the sentence. Scout lunged with startling speed, slamming into the man holding the detonator. The device skittered across the floor. Nora, quick as a striking hawk, snatched her flashlights and hurled it at the second henchman. It struck his wrist, making his gun clatter to the ground. "Andrew, the emergency valve!" she shouted. Andrew ran to the massive red wheel built into the chamber wall, the secondary floodgate release. He threw his weight into it. The wheel screamed in protest, but slowly turned. A massive gate slammed down between them and Kane's group, sealing the tunnel. The henchmen were trapped on the other side, but a new danger began instantly. Water surged upward through the lower channels as the pressure system redirected. "We triggered the failsafe," Nora gasped. "We have minutes before the chamber fills." They ran. Scout led the way, barking sharply to keep Andrew alert as freezing water lapped at their heels. The tunnels shook, lights flickering, metal creaking like a dying beast. At the upper ladder, a spotlight cut through the darkness. "Sheriff's office! Andrew, hold on!" Sheriff Laura Dean, a sturdy woman in her mid-50s, with short black hair and a tough, weather-beaten face shaped by decades in law enforcement, leaned over the opening. Her brown eyes were sharp, commanding, but tinged with worry. Behind her, deputies hauled rescue ropes and flood lamps. She grabbed Andrew's wrist while deputies pulled Nora up. Scout scrambled out with powerful kicks of his hind legs. Moments later, Kane fled through a maintenance hatch, only to be intercepted by deputies waiting topside. The echoes of the underground flood rumbled like distant thunder, and as Andrew collapsed on the muddy ground beside Scout, he felt, finally, the slow settling of justice. A thin, pale sunrise brushed the old mill yard with a sheen of gold as Andrew Collins stood beside the newly restored sign, its letters carved clean and proud, Mill Creek Industrial Heritage Site. The crisp morning breeze carried the scent of sawdust, river moss, and fresh paint, an unlikely blend that felt like a promise. Scout, his sturdy 6-year-old German Shepherd, with the black and tan coat still damp from rolling in morning dew, sat beside him, tail flicking in lazy arcs as if approving the new chapter of their lives. Reporters had come and gone over the past week, along with county officials and historical preservationists. Among them was Elliot Monroe, a tall, rail-thin historian in his early 40s with sandy hair that refused to stay combed and rectangular glasses that slid down his nose whenever he grew excited, an unfortunately frequent occurrence. Elliot was earnest, meticulous, and famously forgetful, a combination that made him beloved by museum volunteers but mocked by impatient bureaucrats. His arrival that morning was marked by a frantic wave and a stack of clipboards nearly toppling from his arms. "Andrew, the plaques came in. They misspelled hydraulic on one of them, but I bullied the engraver into fixing it. Politely bullied. Sort of," he added, cheeks reddening behind his glasses. Andrew chuckled, feeling a warmth he hadn't known in years, the kind that began at the ribs and spread outward, thawing the cold patches life had left behind. Sheriff Laura Dean soon joined them, her sturdy figure framed against the sunlight. Her short black hair was tucked behind her ears, and lines of fatigue eased as she allowed herself the rare luxury of a small, proud smile. "County Court accepted every piece of evidence," she said, handing Andrew a sealed envelope. "The prosecutors are calling it one of the most important fraud cases in state history. A century-long wound finally stitched up." Andrew opened the envelope. Inside was formal confirmation of a reward granted to him for discovering and safeguarding the documents. It was more money than he'd expected, enough to clear every cent of debt that had haunted him, enough to start fresh, enough to simply breathe. But the decision had already been made. He stepped inside the renovated mill office, where a bulletin board displayed plans for the new Mill Creek Relief Fund, a charity Andrew had founded using nearly all the reward money. Its mission was simple: support working families and veterans with medical expenses, repairing the very damage the old fraud had caused. Nora Hayes's name sat proudly at the top of the advisory board. The elderly historian had been tireless, despite her wiry frame and silver hair that always looked windswept. She now worked with local teachers to turn the underground maze into a living lesson on civic duty, corruption, and resilience. Scout padded inside after Andrew, nose twitching at the comforting smell of coffee and baked goods. He gave a soft bark, one that Andrew recognized immediately as the "I'm not guilty, but prepare yourself" bark. On the desk, a half-eaten waffle sagged on a plate. Crumbs littered the floor like guilty confetti. "Really?" Andrew sighed. Scout answered by gently placing a paw on Andrew's boot, ears folding backward into an expression of strategic innocence. As Andrew knelt to clean the mess, a quiet knock sounded. At the doorway stood Janet Rowe, a woman in her 60s, short and soft-featured, hair a cloud of white curls framing warm brown eyes. She was the widow of a CCC worker, one of the men who had built the water system inside the hill. Janet had lived most of her life believing her husband died of an ordinary work accident, but the recovered documents proved he had tried to blow the whistle on the corruption and was silenced for it. She held a tin of homemade peach muffins in hands that trembled slightly. "I just wanted to say thank you," she whispered. Her voice was gentle but carried decades of stored hurt. "For giving him back his truth." Andrew felt the weight of her gratitude settle over him like a hand on his shoulder. "He was brave," he said quietly. "Braver than anyone knew." Janet pressed the tin into his hands, tears shining. Scout approached her, nudging her palm with his warm muzzle. She smiled, stroking the dog's head. "Your partner here," she said. "He might just be the bravest of all." Scout's tail thumped proudly. Outside, the creek shimmered under the rising sun, its waters flowing clear and unburdened, no longer hiding secrets. Workers bustled around the site, restoring beams and polishing the old hydraulic wheels under Elliot's wildly animated supervision. Children on a school tour traced the chalk marks that the CCC had left, marks Scout had rediscovered decades later. Andrew brewed a fresh pot of coffee in the restored office. Scout sprawled across the floor, resting after his breakfast crime spree. For the first time in years, Andrew felt wholly, quietly settled. When he stepped outside with his mug, sunlight washed the yard in a warm, forgiving glow. Scout trotted beside him, muzzle lifted to greet the wind. And as the creek murmured and the town slowly woke, Andrew realized something simple yet profound. Sometimes the thing everyone dismisses as worthless is the very heart of a community waiting to beat again. And sometimes it takes a loyal dog to lead you straight to it. And in the quiet glow of that Mill Creek morning, Andrew finally understood something he had spent a lifetime walking past without seeing. Sometimes God hides his miracles in the plainest places. An old mill no one wanted, a creek everyone forgot, a past the world tried to bury, or a loyal dog who insists on leading you one step further than your fear allows. Scout was never just a dog. He was a reminder that God's guidance doesn't always arrive on thunderclouds or in grand voices from above. Sometimes it comes on four paws, with muddy fur and bright, earnest eyes. Sometimes the Lord's whisper sounds like a bark in the dark, a tug on your sleeve, or the push you need to look again at what everyone else calls worthless. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. No day is too ordinary for God to place a blessing in it. No heart is too tired for Him to restore. No path is too lost for Him to light again. If this story touched you, even just a little, may you carry that reminder into your own life. Look for the quiet miracles. Look for the small signs. Look for the gentle ways God nudges you back into hope. And may the Lord bless you, protect you, and guide your steps just as surely as He guided Andrew and Scout.